Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Charles Waldheim, Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here for the 2010 Frederick Law Olmsted Memorial Lecture. The Olmsted Lecture is offered here at the Graduate School of Design annually, and it's had a history of focusing on histories and theories, the body of ideas in landscape architecture. And so it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Sebastien Marot. Marot is trained in philosophy and in history. He came to my knowledge, but also to a kind of international prominence with the founding of a very influential journal in Paris called Le Visiteur in the middle of the 1990s, a journal that he continued to edit, I think, consequentially through 2002. Marot has taught in a range of leading design schools in architecture and landscape over the last number of years, and he's presently appointed Professor of Architectural History at the École d'Architecture de la Ville et des Territoires in Marne-la-Vallée, Paris. For me, Marot has been among the clearest and most articulate theorists of what's come to be known as the suburban. And in a way, his theory of suburbanism will form a part of his talk this evening. I won't say more about it, other than to suggest that his description of, in the work of OMA, two strains of thought, one of which he'll describe as a kind of super-urbanism, another a kind of suburbanism, has, I think, helped shed important light on the discourse around landscape urbanism. Please join me in welcoming Sebastien Marot.
So, can you hear me when I talk like here? Yeah? Okay, great. So so it works. Okay, it's a great honor for me to be with you today in this room under the patronage, the intimidating patronage of Olmsted, and I want to thank you, to thank my friends. Charles Waldheim and Moisen Mostafavi for their invitation and for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you. The last and only time I gave a lecture in this room, in this auditorium, was almost 10 years ago, when I was a visiting critic here on the occasion of a conference and exhibition that we put together on European landscape architecture. And I remember that it was on this occasion, I think, that we first met, Charles and I. So this will be, in a way, a 10 years after update. My subject tonight will be an intellectual adventure or plot in which I embarked already 6 or 7 years ago. I started it as a kind of amusing promenade, then turned it into an intensive PhD research. I didn't have a PhD, so I needed to have like papers. And I'm now preparing it for publication in book form. To this little odyssey, I've given the working title of Palimpsestuous Ithaca, a relative manifesto for sub-urbanism, but I also call it sometimes Exile on Main Street. So you'll choose whichever suits you better. So my whole subject, yeah, can we have the image? My whole subject is contained in this box. But before I open it, let me give you 1 or 2 clues about what led me into this subject and about the meaning of the notions and the words that I'm using. I've been a visitor. I used to say I like to be visiting critic or visiting professor because that's exactly what suits me. You know, I feel myself as being a professing visitor, right? Or professional visitor. And as a visitor, I have several heroes. And one of them is unquestionably J.B. Jackson. J.B. Jackson, yes, it's one of my heroes. And I've been always very interested in the way his books are built. Because it's collections of essays, right? So it's like a varia. But they're very well composed. For instance, this one starts by a text called The Word Itself, meaning looking for a definition of what landscape is, the word being landscape, of course. And then it ends up with an essay called Concluding with Landscapes. So it starts with a singular, ends up with a plural. And in this concluding essay, Jackson explains that one of the main lessons that he drew from his life going through landscapes of Europe and America, one of the lessons is that he said there are three landscapes. Landscape 1, Landscape 2, Landscape 3. Landscape 1 he calls either the medieval landscape or the vernacular landscape. And he said it had two characteristics. One was that it was small landscape. It was a patchwork of small landscape that made sense locally. It's a local landscape using, the materials from the area, etc. And the second characteristic is that it changes, it mutates all the time. The three-field systems, etc. It was a mutating landscape. Then there is landscape 2. Landscape 2, he has three names for it. Either the classical landscape, or the aristocratic landscape, or the political landscape. Interesting hesitation here. And for him, landscape 2 is opposed in all ways to landscape 1. When landscape 1 was like made sense on small scale, this one makes sense on broader and broader scales. When the other one was a mutating landscape, this one is a fixed limits, It's the canonical landscape, the one that took over from the Renaissance, etc. And then there is landscape 3. And landscape 3, he has no names for it. But he spent his life liking that landscape, visiting that landscape, describing that landscape. And this landscape, we understand, for him started at the Industrial Revolution, and really took over after World War II, right? And it's the landscape that flourished along circulation, transportation, axis, etc. That landscape of shoe boxes, he said, that they change all the time. So what he suggests, although he doesn't name it, is that this third landscape would have something to do with the first one. And the title of the book is Discovering the Vernacular Landscape, that landscape. I'm interested, what I like in this text is not so much the distinction of those three landscapes as the hesitation of Jackson in naming them. Are they periods in the history of landscape, or are they kinds of landscape? Because I think that they are both, and that in a way they are all contemporary. All of you could name a landscape today that is kind of landscape 1. Vernacular. Of course, we all know the grid of Jefferson, political landscape we know. And then the third landscape we all know, of course, right? So they are all, in a way, here together, juxtaposed, but in many ways they are imbricated into one another, superimposed to one another. And if you look at what artists look at when they look at landscape, they often look at those phenomena of superimposition, imbrication, of different orders, regimes of landscape that meet in any given landscape, right? So, in a way, I would say that to some extent, all landscapes today are what I would call hyper landscapes, right? They are made of several of those landscape layers. Okay, so in another text, which is right in the middle of this other book, which I translated in French, in the middle you have an essay called Landscape as Theater, where Jackson explains that the main metaphor through which landscape 2, the canonical, the classical, was made, was the theater. A landscape was a scene that made sense from a certain point of view with perspective, etc. With actors, human beings playing parts in that landscape. And he says the problem is that if we continue to use that metaphor of the theater, we will not be able to envision landscapes of today. No, it's useless. So we need, he said, another metaphor. But it's been 2 centuries that we should have found another one, right? And we still haven't. So we are still searching. These are the last words. We are still searching for another metaphor. My question to Jackson would be, a new metaphor for what? For landscape 3, if landscape 3 was the contemporary landscape, or for that imbrication, superimposition, of landscape, for hyper landscapes. Because if it was the case, then other metaphors have been proposed from the field of urban design or landscape architecture or architecture, right? One of them being the famous palimpsest, right? Proposed, for instance, by André Corbeau's, but by many others in the 80s. Palimpsest, being that parchment onto which you write a text and then another one and then another. You erase, but the parchment keeps traces of all these things. So you have a kind of accumulation of layers of text. It's a 3-dimensional parchment with 3 dimensions. So Jackson might have refused that as being a mere analogy. It's a curiosity of epigraphy, the palimpsest. We do not use palimpsest today. Okay, but then the same people who proposed the palimpsest came back with another one, which is very close to it, which is the hypertext. There is no doubt that we are plunged into hypertext as the classic were into the theater, right? That hypertext is like a shaping the way we see the world. So I don't know. I do think that we could combine the two of them, that it would be good to combine those 2 metaphors, with that of the theater, by the way, also, right? To combine them, because one is physical, and territories are physical, the palimpsest, and the other is more fluid, allow us to navigate, and I think territories have to be both envisioned as palimpsest and hypertext. You can choose. But what I think is that trying to find a matrix of a representational matrix to envision landscape, to envision hyper landscape, it might be useful to revisit the way artists at the early 20th century tried to suggest or to represent the famous 4th dimension that scientists were talking about, right? Because what is a hyper landscape, if not an imbrication of 3D landscape? So something like the fourth dimension. You know that writers were very interested into that, artists, painters, and among those painters and artists, one who spent really his life investigating playfully the 4th dimension is Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp, you could say that his main work, I mean one of his main masterpieces, The Large Glass, or The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, behind its erotico-pataphysical plot is a meditation between the relationship between the 3D domain of the bachelors on the bottom and the 4-dimensional realm into which the bride blossoms. You know that Marcel Duchamp called that separation between the 2 domains the bride's mantle. You know, the bride's mantle, it was difficult to go through that mantle. And going from the 3D to the 4-dimensional would mean going through that thing. So I think it's quite interesting to superimpose Duchamp, Large Glass, to that canonical view of landscape as theater, with the 3 natures there. The first nature in the background here, as given by the gods and inhabited by gods, obviously. And then agriculture, the second nature in the midground, and the third nature on the foreground, as a kind of 3-dimensional map, with emblematic relationship to all the elements of the territory beyond there. You see, it's interesting because the Mantel's Bride translates as a kind of tennis net in the middle of the image here, which is a aha, right? So, I'm looking for a kind of verticalization of the traditional perspectivist view, a sectional view of that thing. Every landscape has to be seen sectionally now. And Duchamp, in a way, 30 years after doing the glass, suggested that in this little drawing called Causalité. It's always play on words there, where he's using the glass as a window to look at a 3D landscape of hills, of causalité, embedded hills. A landscape that will make its way into the last masterpiece of Duchamp, Étant donné, which is linked by all kinds of stuff to the plot of the large glass itself. Okay. The second thing I need to explain is this idea of suburbanism, very shortly. Suburbanism is a word that I started to use when looking at the work of landscape architects in the early 90s in France, in Europe. And this is how I summarize for me what they were doing, what they were bringing to the field of urbanism. I would say that they carried with them a kind of subversion of traditional urbanism that would go from site to program. You know, instead of being in composition, looking for an equilibrium between the given of the site and the given of the program, that they would go from site to program, that they dreamt in a way of engendering the program from the site itself, a kind of poetic or rhetoric of design that I thought was very interesting. Of course, I was and I am aware that another subversion of urbanism coming from one of the most creative vanguard of architecture at that time did exactly the reverse, like meaning engendering the site from the program, like using the program as a way to produce literally a programmatic carpet or tapestry there. And I like both, actually. I'm interested in both. But I think that super-urbanism, as I call it, super-urbanism has an undeserved advantage on sub-urbanism. And that undeserved advantage is that it has a hero, a fantastic poet, whose name is Rem Koolhaas, who provided super-urbanism not only with a fantastic project, but also with a manifesto, Delirious New York. Which I consider as the undisputed manifesto for super-urbanism, for that way of designing. And Koolhaas transported in the field of landscape architecture itself that super-urbanist way of designing with his famous project for La Villette. La Villette, a place where today we have what I consider as one of the masterpieces of sub-urbanism, meaning the bamboo garden dug into the depth of this industrial ground here. Okay. So I thought the two things are so opposed, so symmetrically opposed, that it would be good to do a relative manifesto for sub-urbanism. Relative for two reasons. Relative because I do not intend to advocate suburbanism absolutely, right, in every circumstance, but relatively, and relative also because it would be relative to that of Rem Koolhaas, right? Like turning his manifesto upside down, if possible. So I could use his to shape this little manifesto. But he has Manhattan as a site for his manifesto. A fantastic site, what a powerful site. And I didn't find any powerful site where I could do that demonstration with the same. So I thought I had found one when I remarked to myself, I noted that several people, several figures that I was interested in, at some point had been in the little city of Ithaca in upstate New York. So I thought it'd be interesting, maybe Ithaca would do. So I managed to get an invitation to teach at Cornell and came there. And I knew nothing about Ithaca at the time. So I told the student I'm going to do a site-specific theory seminar on Ithaca. Ithaca is the subject of our theory seminar. And as I knew nothing, I came up with this image, of the box in a suitcase of Duchamp, saying, because I was also a little tired with reading papers also. And I thought, let's do three-dimensional papers, right? You build a box, a suitcase, where you will gather all your findings about this site that might be relevant, and you have to organize them into... So that was the thing. And so you'll see some of these boxes popping up in the course of my lecture. But I will use one more than the others, which is this one, where the student had the very good idea to do a perfect replica of Duchamp's box, the way it functioned, except that all the materials were about Ithaca, right? So it was a duplicate of the box, but about Ithaca. He was only using one thing as a kind of mandala and directory, which was the large glass itself, in the laptop of the box, on top of the box there. Okay. So I have to tell you, my lecture is going to be like a duration of a feature movie, 70 to 80 minutes from now on. I have to tell you. So as I'm doing that, I want to mention two movies that I would like to emulate. Right? One is this one, Russian Ark by Vladimir Sokurov. A fantastic film where Sokurov, used the Museum of the Hermitage in Moscow to evoke 300 years of Russian history, right? And he did it by following a kind of character, this guy, and each time that guy opens doors, it's another epoch, another period in the history. So it's with Catherine of Russia, and then, Pierre le Grand, and then, etc. But the wonderful thing is that they did that movie exactly in 1 hour and 30 minutes, one shot, right? He followed the guy like that. They knew they could do it like twice. If after 20 minutes it failed, they could do it another time. But then, no. So they shot the movie, like that. And then after 1 hour and 30 minutes, no montage, was finished. The movie. So I think this compression of time is fantastically strong in that movie. And the other one is, of course, this one, Fitzcarraldo. The story of that incredible guy who wants to build an opera house in the middle of the Amazonia and has an idea to do that, to earn money to do that, to exploit territories that are inaccessible, to do that, to have his boat go up a hill, right, etc. But the wonderful thing is that Herzog did it for the movie. Right. So it's a movie about itself, in a way here. And when the guy is at the beginning of the movie is trying to convince people to give him money to do that, right? He has that sentence: "I am planning something geographical." I think that's fantastic. In my modest way, I'm also planning something geographical. So we're here in the Finger Lakes area, right? A fantastic allegory of geography, 10 lakes like that, as if a cat had scratched, the surface of the earth and left the deep imprints in there. Okay, we know who the cat was. It was those glaciers, right, that came down several times across northern America and left lots of traces in the area. And we have that Lake Cayuga, on the inlet of which is Ithaca and Cornell. Lake Cayuga is one of those through valleys. Glaciologists call through valleys those valleys that were in the axis of the progression of the ice and that were over-carved, deeply carved by those. They are deeper than sea level, So all these valleys, north-south, are called through valleys. The valleys that were perpendicular to the progression of the ice were mainly occupied by the ice, which then retreated, leaving them hanging at a much higher level. So that's why they call them the hanging valleys, right? Starting a whole process of hydrological erosion, creating cascades, gorges, which are in the middle of the campus at Cornell, for those of you who know that. The first promoter of that glacial theory is a guy from Harvard. Actually, he's a Swiss guy, Louis Agassiz, right? Who didn't have a lot of success with his theories on glaciology in Switzerland, and came to the States and was appointed professor at Harvard here. But the guys of Cornell, when they wanted to hire people and started the university in the 1860s, they asked him to come to Cornell. And he came, and this is what he said. I was never in a single locality where there is presented so much material in so many branches of natural history as here in this beautiful valley. So you see, the guy comes from the inauguration of Cornell University and says, the building are just like they're trying to build it. He says, no, the university is not in the buildings, it's in the site itself. The institution is the site itself. Okay, so a whole school of glaciologists will develop at Cornell, right? You see them here. They are in Greenland, for instance, here, at the end of the 19th century. And this is a very bad photo that I found in the archives, but this is the Cornell Glacier in Greenland. So they mapped, there is an anamorphosis of Cornell up in Greenland there because they named everything after, but there is also a Harvard Glacier in Alaska and Columbia one. They all had theirs, but this one is particularly nice. This is Mount Schurman, because Schurman was the president of the university at that time. Here, they are in Alaska in 1909. Wonderful photos taken by a guy that Professor Tarr took with him, which was Oskar von Engeln. He was then called on campus Professor von. Professor von was a photographer who did all those photos during those trips there. And you see him here coming out of his dark room tent. Can you imagine? So you have this actinic light, and in the middle you have that dark room tent and the guy developing his film there, right? This is a kind of image of the university in Alaska. You see the dark room revealing knowledge there. And here, look at that. This is Oskar von Engeln washing his negatives in the water of the glacier. It could be Robert Smithson, right? It's fantastic image. And when they came back, they built the corresponding, thing to the darkroom tent, which was the Ice Laboratory on campus. This is the Ice Laboratory, where they had, they took a huge chunk of original glacier ice, had it brought to Cornell by train, by Pacific Railroad, and they did lots of experience, trying to understand how ice could have that erosive power and to shape the land where they were working. And in their publications, to try to give an idea of the magnitude of the glaciers, this is what they did. Mapping Washington over the Columbia or the Grand Pacific Glacier up in Alaska. Or, look at that, the monument of Bunker Hill here in Boston, to give an idea, of how big that is, right? Here, the Chicago Tribune, you see? And the one I really like, the one I prefer, a high-rise building in New York. So you see, the skyscraper dwarfed by the earth scraper, right? So you see, I'm starting to weave my plot, right? So we could say there is a kind of equivalence here. We could cast Manhattan out of Lake Cayuga, right? But we could also cast its skyscrapers out of the gorges. What is interesting is that geologists call all these layers of sediments horizons. That's a horizon in geology, right? Horizon. So you have here a hyperlandscape made of the superimposition of all the successive landscape, that took over, and then carved by the glacier who built a kind of hyper landscape, in there. So you have a kind of equation between the stories of the programmatic stratification in the skyscraper and the stratification of horizons in the hyper landscapes of Cornell. I like this one mainly for color issues. Okay. So you see here a class of geology in Cornell, in the rooms of Cornell, in the gorges, trying to decipher the glacial morphemes of this hyper landscape. This one could be a Jeff Wall, no? Photo posed like that. Okay. Okay, but glacial theory is recent. Where are we exactly? This is one of the first images published by Rem Koolhaas in Delirious New York, the phantasmatic map of Jolin of 17th century representing New Amsterdam. If you look into the caption, the legend, the cartouche here, here we are in that region here, right? Called Lac des Iroquois, peuple très cruel. Lakes of the Iroquois people, very cruel people. So this is where we are. We are in Iroquois, in the Finger Lakes. The Iroquois, I'm not going to dwell on them, but it's a very interesting issue with the Iroquois because they have a very vertical understanding of the landscape itself. This is one of the myths of their cosmology, you know, saying that there is a kind of sky village up there with Sky Chief. And the story says that the Sky Chief one day discovered that his own wife, Sky Woman, was pregnant, but he suspected that she was pregnant because of her own brother. So he was very unhappy, uprooted a sky tree, took Sky Woman and threw her, you know. And then in the Iroquois tales, she falls, very long time. And then she lands on the back of a turtle here. And as she lands, the back of the turtle transformed into the earth. So we are living on the back of a turtle, you know, floating over a primal sea, right, and under a sky village. And this image is articulated to another one, that of the Confederation of the Iroquois, whose foyer was each of the 5 eastern Finger Lakes. So Cayuga was one of them, Seneca, where they were the keeper of the West, the Mohawks, the keeper of the eastern door, etc. And they were, as you know, a very powerful confederation, so that all the colonies tried to hire them into their wars with the others. They were very powerful during the French and Indian Wars and were partly responsible for pushing the French up north. And then, of course, there was a problem when the war for independence started. And most of them stayed with the English. They also feared that the guy who were there were more dangerous than the one in England. Anyway, but they broke on this issue. The Confederation broke. And Washington, who feared the big support that the Iroquois could give to the English, sent a powerful army to eradicate Iroquois. That was the program, eradicate Iroquois. So this army came, you know, and they burned literally all the village, the plantations, everything. Wonderful orchards that the soldiers saw, you know, and they said, that's an interesting area. So that the President of the United States is called by the Iroquois Town Destroyer now, and it's hereditary, so the title. There. Then they lived in an archipelago of reservations up north and dreamt about their lost territory. And because they were not subject, supposedly, to vertigo, they played a very active part in the construction of iron bridges up there. And also, you see here a Mohawk on the construction site of a skyscraper in New York in the 70s. So for 10 to 15 years, this whole area of Iroquois is a vacant lot, right? A vacant lot, but they're working in the offices of the Surveyor General of the state. And they designed that military tract, a perfect grid, right, of lots of 600 acres, that are to be given to the soldiers who were active during the independence war as a way of paying them. So they designed that huge thing. And the first settlers arrive. The guy who is responsible for the design of this grid is Simeon De Witt. Simeon De Witt is a very important figure in the history of planning in the United States. He stayed in office as a state surveyor general for 50 years, right, until his death in 1834. So he's a very important guy. And he is grid man, right? He makes grids. For any extension of cities, he does grids. For the creation of new towns, he does grids. It's simpler. And of course, the one for which he should be very famous is the grid of Manhattan of 1811 that he designed. Right? He was the designer in the commission. Okay, so this is the man who created, as Koolhaas says, the most courageous acts of prediction in Western civilization, is Simeon De Witt. But while De Witt is working on the grid, this is what he writes to his cousin. The place to which I purpose to go when I have no business here, meaning in New York, is a village of at least 30 houses and fronts a plain of the richest lowlands. If I should live 20 years longer, I'm confident I should see Ithaca as important a place as Utica now. Its advantages and situation cannot fail of giving it a rapid growth and making it one of the first inland places of trade. There is no place of its size in the country where there is such a stir of business. I mention these things to show that what I have contemplated for my future residence is not a dreary, solitary country situation. So you see that. That's interesting. Huh? The planner of New York dreams of Ithaca. You know? That's interesting. And so what does he do in Ithaca? He takes the lion's share. It's very weird when you read history about the planning of Ithaca, because this is the military tract. Every lot is 600 acres, each of them, right? Except one, which is there, just right in the middle, and the other have to, and in the plan, it's the only exception, and they say, well, this has already been attributed to somebody, etc. But, that's very weird because he has a lot of clout, because 3 years after, he's the owner, the surveyor general. It goes to his stepfather and then to him. So he designs an exception in the grid for himself, just in the axis of the lake, right? And there, as he is surveyor general, he can name things. The military tract had names of European history, Milton, but also Homer. So that was the Ulysses township, right? He named it Ulysses. And then as he's the master, he does the maps. He called the city, there is nobody, Ithaca, right? For two reasons, he says. One is because it was known, that place among the settlers, as Sodom. That was not good. It was better to name it Ithaca. And then because of supposedly there was a resemblance between the lake and the bay in the island of the Greek navigators. I don't know how he could have figured that out, but you can judge, maybe, here. So you see the thing. There is a first kind of palimpsestuous effect. All those names coming from European history, that name the settlements, everything, but they keep the Indian names for the lakes, for instance, or for the falls, for the natural features, right? It's interesting. So E.B. White, in a kind of homage to his alma mater called I'd Send My Son to Cornell, starts his text by saying that Cornell is in Ithaca, New York, where Greek meets Indian. All right. De Witt designs a little city. He plays Monopoly there, but he designs a little city, which is interesting because it's an inland island. You see the two gorges running there, okay? And he designs basins around a little grid, right? Connected by a canal to the lake, right? So it would be connected to the lake, and the lake, because he's designing the Erie Canal, the same guy, would be connected then to the Great Lakes, then to, etc., then to the world. Right? So it would be an inland Ithaca, an inland island. Islands are very important in urban design. Then, of course, it will evolve differently. It will not be built like that. And finally, after 30 years of playing Ulysses in the whole state, De Witt will be able, for the 3 last years of his life, to come to Ithaca in the Clinton house. And he will be buried, he will die in the place where he dreamt of having a house built, looking at the city and then at the lake. So we'll leave him here, but I want you to remember 2 things. First, this little tension between the downstate metropolis and this upstate little tree city. And second, the fact that Ithaca was selected, chosen, built by a geographer. Okay, just at the moment when he dies, the first proactive manifesto for Ithaca are published. Either painted, there is a painter who turns around Ithaca from all the hills, trying to capture, the good perspective point. Here he's on South Hill. We could be in Versailles, you see. The lake is like the Grand Canal, like looking up north, looking up to the Erie Canal, looking up to the rest of the world there. And then he's on West Hill here. But it's the story of many cities in the United States, and Chicago, for instance, where they were expecting the future from a direction, and then it comes from another direction. The train comes from the south. So there is another palimpsestuous effect here. Okay. And so it's in train and not by boat that the Ulysses will come back to Ithaca. So those proactive manifestos, they are numerous, and one of them is called Views of Ithaca and its Environs by an Impartial Observer. So of course these people are hired by the city boosters, to help them put their city on the map there. And they all do the same thing, like a clockwise tour of all the gorges. They are so fantastic, so beautiful, and they describe how it's a picturesque machine, right? Where you have all that water coming, all that power coming, and then all the mills in the gorges that transform that power into richness, right? And into activities, and then flow through the city to go into the vast reservoir of beauty of the lake, right? This is the machine that they describe there. But their most enthusiastic pages are not for those gorges. They are for the mills. They are for the little infrastructures that the settlers have put in the gorge. They praise the adjective nature of this tunnel, for instance, that diverted the flow of the water to feed the mills, on a continual basis. Or this little convex dam, which is an adjective playing with the force of the stream and the gorge. Okay, and praising those infrastructure, they are unconsciously praising the guy who built them, Ezra Cornell, who is going to play such a role into that place. Ezra Cornell was a self-taught engineer, right, who came to that place, worked for the mill owners, built those infrastructure, had a passion for agriculture, agronomy, bought land there. And then there was the big crisis of 1840s. He was without work. And then he went across the United States to try to sell a plow, that plow here. And during this trip, he met the guys who were putting the Morse cable, right, who had the contract to put the first Morse between Baltimore and Washington. And Ezra Cornell invented a machine, fantastic machine, that would, carve the earth, put the cable, then close it, etc. Then he will say it's stupid because just put it on poles, perfect. But then anyway, he's into the thing, and he will make a fortune by cabling the East. And with that fortune, he's a Quaker, so he doesn't give it to his kids. He's a benefactor. And he builds first a library in the city, which is both a club for agriculture, for farmers, also a library, etc., etc. But he has so much money that then he decides to locate a land-grant university that the state is going to fund. He managed to locate it on lands that he gives himself, that he had bought between the two gorges on East Hill, and to have that Cornell University that would associate, traditional academic discipline with applied sciences, and that would be also open to women, progressive, etc. So this is the situation. When you're on campus here, on the main art squad, there is Ezra Cornell's statue, which is here. It's very interesting because it's right on the top of the hill, looking at the landscape, but he turns his back to it. He's looking to the farmlands, right, where he expected that his university would develop. He knew that it would become a huge thing. And he's facing a guy, which is Andy White. He's a more posed guy, He's sitting on a circle, right? He's sitting in the, very quite self-conscious pose of the important man. And he was a product of the aristocracy of banking in the state of New York from Syracuse. They two, both, one coming from applied science, the other coming from the aristocracy of, he was a historian, built that university together. They had very, very different visions of what a university should be. And then if you follow the axis of these two statues, you fall on this building down there, round building, very big building called Bailey Hall, just in the axe. And Bailey Hall is named after this guy, who is probably the most important guy that ever went at Cornell, Liberty Hyde Bailey, a botanist, horticulturist, super important figure in the history of Cornell, but also in the history of farming in the United States, in agronomy. He was the champion of nature study. So he champion of an idea that the campus should open itself out, should go out in the site. In the schools, have schools build, grow gardens, everywhere. And so he managed to develop that program very strongly from Cornell. He almost became the Ministry of Agriculture in the States. He was the head of the Commission on Farming for Roosevelt, and he wrote fantastic books. He wrote 90 books, this guy. He lived 93 years or 94 years. He was a very old guy. And he's considered today, and should be considered today, as one of the founding father of American environmentalism. Many, many books that he called the background books. We should take care of the background. That was his whole idea there. Okay, so we have at Cornell 3 campuses on top of one another. You have the campus of the geotechnician, of the engineer from the gorges, who built labs in the gorges, hydraulic labs like that, and who conceived his whole university as a kind of dam stretched between the two gorges to retain knowledge from a too quick downstream devaluation into applications, a dam that would retain the power of knowledge, that would accumulate the power of knowledge there. Then you have A.D. White, historian, a would-be architect. He loved architecture. He created there one of the first, not the first, one of the first school of architecture in the States, endowed it with a fantastic library that he had, right? And he had a completely different dream. He dreamt of a Ruskinian conversation of domes, campaniles, colonnades, etc. Lessons in brick and stone, if you like. And he had his way after the death of Cornell. So you had another campus coming there, the red brick one, as he said. And you see him, old man then, contemplating his work there. And then you have the landscape architect, the ruralist. He coined, actually, the term ruralism very early, when urbanism was starting, as a necessary complement, or challenge to urbanism. Something like ruralism needed to be done, at that time. And he created the State College of Agriculture, that it's a mixed university there. He was the guy who did that, so fulfilling the ambitions of Cornell in that domain, and in the end, created his campus. He had a hortorium, right, which he extrapolated into an arboretum, which became what is known at Cornell as the Cornell plantations, meaning the whole territory between the two gorges, far into the lands, including the farms, the active farms, would be part of that university. So you have three visions of campus superimposed to one another in this place. This is how E.B. White followed with his text. Cornell is a fairly big institution. It has 5,000 or 6,000 students, counting the rabbit hunters, and it dominates from its high hills above Cayuga Lake, the town which lies at its feet. This physical and spiritual dominance of art over life, of gown over town, is a good thing for a boy to experience for a while. In a place like Columbia or New York University, it must be obvious to the student just from reading the papers that the town holds the whip hand. In New York, dwellers in apartment buildings are in a position to spit out of the window and have it land on the head of a philosopher. This naturally gives the latter the wrong impression and makes him willing to compromise or even to dodge. But in Ithaca, the library tower commands the valley, learning dominates industry, and even the toboggan slide deposits the red-cheeked scholar far above the roofs of trade. So we are exactly in what the classic called the suburban position, in those suburban villas high on their hills, looking at the city over the roofs, like in Villa Lante, for instance, here, or in Frascati, exactly the same situation. See? So in Ithaca, we have that perspectivist thing, right? But it's like rotated. It's one on top of the other, right? We are starting to enter into Duchamp affair here. So it will be interesting just to use the machinery of the large glass, and have it worked with the water of the mills of Ithaca, right? That's what I do. Put the machinery of the large glass and make it run with the water of Ithaca. There are 9 bachelors in the large glass. And we've seen 3 of them, Cornell, White, and Bailey. Colin Rowe is well known for having spent his life thinking about this imbrication or superimposition of spaces. First at the scale of architecture with his notion of transparency, and then at the scale of urban design with his notion of collage. At Cornell, he dreamt with his student of reconciling the theaters of prophecies of the moderns, their wonderful machines, with the real cities, existing cities, and their past, the deep cities, Rome being the perfect palimpsestuous city for him that would be able to welcome those things. So in his Cornell, with him, become a kind of Corb Academy, a mecca of space talk, where his student and his colleagues produce text about that negotiation, contextualism, and where they do projects where they operate that reconciliation in several other cities, Manhattan here, with projects for Harlem, and it is in Cornell associated with the Museum of Modern Art that creates the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies there at the time. But of course, the vanishing point of Colin Rowe is Rome. Rome is the model city. There is one image of Ithaca in Collage City. And this is to illustrate Main Street. He's talking to Venturi, saying, Main Street is hard. Main Street is not almost all right. Main Street is tough, and he knew what he was talking about. You know, it's tough. So in my opinion, there is nothing more symbolic of the rendezvous manqué between the contextualists and their own context, perhaps than the theater that Stirling built just above Cascadilla Gorge. A very heavy suitcase of references, just you know, on the verge of the gorge here, with a fantastic loggia, but so colossal that you don't see anything through it. You know, you don't see the landscape at all through it. And I like very much this image, you know, where the president of Cornell University is showing the site, and Stirling is somewhere looking somewhere else. You know. Sorry. In a way, Ithaca was much more present in the Odyssey of Oswald Mathias Ungers. Ungers, as you know, is invited by Colin Rowe to come as a chair of architecture at Cornell. He was the rising star of architecture then in Germany. He had many references in common with Colin Rowe, if only the Villa Adriana and such things. And he had, in his first project, embarked, as in Noah's Arks, all the invariants of architecture. You know, the invariants, ingredients of architecture embarked into design that combined them like that. Neo-rationalism, it will be called. But he had also an incredible empathy for the sites where he worked. And for instance, this is the publication of his Grundzug Süd project in 1963, I think, where you see the plan of the construction, you know, a huge thing there, and then the photos only argumented from photos of the existing site. They will all be teared down by the project, but they all justify the position that he takes in his new building. So an incredible empathy for sites. Then he was hired in Berlin, where he did fantastic. He said to the student, you don't go anymore, you know, do field trips to Greece and everything. We're in Berlin, we stay in Berlin, right? And we work on Berlin. This is site-specific seminar also, you know. Only Berlin. And there he wanted to experiment, you know, the telescoping of programs of the metropolis, of the Großstadt, right? So what about parks and housing and infrastructure? And let's go. And then the students go, you know, and automatic pilot, and they work, incredible work that they did at that time. So when he arrives to Ithaca, he does a bit the same, you know. His first project is a huge, like, hyper building, you know, a mega structure to disenclave Ithaca, where they solved the problem of infrastructure, of housing, of offices in Ithaca, producing images like that, you know. Fantastic hyper building going across the Ithaca reservoir. So that was probably not for nothing in the rivalry, in the problems that he had with Colin Rowe very, very, very quick, you know. That was not exactly contextualism for Colin Rowe. But Oswald Mathias Ungers went into America. You know, he went into the commune. He published a book with his wife, Kommunen in the Neuen Welt. You know, it was the hippie time at the time. We're in 69, 60, 70. But so, you know, the climate was not very good. You see Ungers surrounded by the Rowe guys, right? And you see that it doesn't go, yeah, it's tough. This is a sketch by Rita Wolf, who was a Léon Krier friend, and she described les frères ennemis, you know, the enemy brothers, Colin Rowe. So Ungers developed an incredible activity, both as a professor and as a chair there, inviting all the vanguards of architecture, the Team 10 guys in the last generation. He was very associated with them. But also the new generation of neo-rationalists there. So Peter Smithson will write even on Ithaca. But after 74, I mean, but the climate is so bad that he works a lot on project in Germany. He's still in Berlin, right? Berlin is the vanishing point of his thoughts. Okay, so he does lots of projects from Ithaca on Berlin, working with his students, with Hans Koolhaas, with not Hans Koolhaas, with Rem Koolhaas, among others. That's a drawing by Rem for one of those projects. They work for Berlin. Projects that are not unsimilar to La Villette, by the way, like this one here. Anyway, they work a lot together. And then from 74 on, Ungers, who will stay a professor, but will like move to Berlin and work only as for a summer school that he does in Manhattan first, and then in Berlin itself. Berlin, where he will write with Rem Koolhaas his own manifesto, exactly published in '78, like Collage City, which is Berlin as a green archipelago, cities within the city, Berlin as a green archipelago, where they imagine, dealing with the degrowth, ungrowth of Berlin by selecting a few areas transformed into very intense island floating in a green archipelago that you see here, and using the references, high references of architecture and landscape as boosters, genetic manipulation of things that would help boost those islands there. Okay. So he leaves back to Berlin, and he will leave only his son as a kind of Telemachus left behind, who will build like boulders of neo-rationalism in Ithaca, like this house or this one here. Okay. Koolhaas, Ithaca. It's in 1972 that Koolhaas decides to join Ungers in Ithaca, to go to Ithaca to meet Ungers and probably Rowe. At the AA, he did this project, this famous field trip on Berlin. And it is during this field trip that he discovered in a library all the booklets of Ungers' teaching in Berlin that fascinated him. He met Super Studio. Super Studio had its continuous monument go into the wall, so probably this is one of the reasons that led him there. Then embarked into his Exodus project, which will be the link between London and Manhattan. And also in the Architectural Association, he met, just before leaving, Alvin Boyarsky, who was a Rowe friend of Colin Rowe, who had studied at Cornell and did a thesis on site at Cornell with Rowe. And he was coming back from Chicago, where he had written this fantastic piece called Chicago à la carte, which you know well, Charles. Fantastic piece that will have a tremendous influence on Rem Koolhaas, who will use the medium of the postcard also to do his. I want to read you a little piece of interview published in Architecture d'Aujourd'hui in 1985. After the AA, why did you go to Ithaca instead of New York? I already had a vague intention to do something on New York. I was struck by the fact that this city was maybe the only architectural example in the 20th century which everybody admired, but which at the same time had never been taken seriously by historians. I wanted to correct that. But going directly to New York seemed too obvious, and instead I chose to settle first in a stupid, typically American city. I chose Ithaca because, willing to join Ungers, I knew of his seminars on the Berlin metropolis, the highways, the parks, and large housing districts. I had been told that he chaired the Department of Architecture at Cornell, which is located in this city. Colin Rowe also taught at urban design there. Unfortunately, a real war was raging between them, the reason of which nobody really understood, but which conditioned all their decision and attitudes. A strange war, since they had both a lot in common, if only about collage. Because I was Dutch, Colin Rowe had immediately catalogued me as somewhat German and hence on Ungers' side, which was a very positive thing in a way, because I thus benefited of the kind of friendship that links soldiers in trenches. I remember the first time I saw Colin Rowe. It was in the large room in the basement where he worked. There was a revolting smell, almost no light, and a huge sick dog with a lot of red spots amongst his black hair, somewhat like Chumi's project for La Villette. One only student, black, was working there at a table, and Colin Rowe, bent behind him, was whispering in his ear, Palazzo Pitti, Piazza Navona, as if these were pornographic expressions. It's one of the most shocking scenes I've ever seen, but it tells a lot, I think, about the situation of American architecture. All right. So you see, 1972, The year the best band of the released its best LP, Exile on Main Street, we have our 3 Rolling Stones from Europe meeting, in Ithaca. So Rem Koolhaas goes into developing Exodus and starting Delirious New York, passion for the grid, start collecting with Madelon postcards to document his research. Madelon has even a little exhibition in Ithaca. And after a year, goes finally to New York in the Institute of Urban Studies to work on his book, where he will finish the project of Exodus, publish his first text, and especially on the constructivist and on Leonidov. And if you see the conclusion of this is a real attack at Colin Rowe, right, at contextualists. On any other location, this building would have been ridiculous. This is the red in Moscow. Any other building on this location would have been absurd. That's good for the contextualist. And he publishes also the first thing in opposition, the first element of Delirious New York, works with Ungers on many projects, does the first project, starts OMA there, with Zengelis, Madelon, and Zoe there, and develops an immense friendship with Ungers that will last till the end of Ungers, but especially intense till 78, and will finally publish in his own manifesto on this city. So you see, there is an interesting thing here. One of the big genres of postmodern writing has been what I would call the situated manifesto. You choose a territory in which you see all the seeds of a strategy, that you advocate in a way. So we know it's the learning from syndrome, right, that appears at the early 70s. And so in 78, you have 3 masterpieces in this genre published simultaneously, whose vanishing points are 3 very different cities, Rome, Berlin, and New York, but who share the same distance point in geometry. That thing which is outside the picture but governs the thing too, which is Ithaca, New York, right? So the manifesto for contextualism, the manifesto for urban disurbanism, and the manifesto for Manhattanism here. If you think about it, they have a lot in common, these 3 manifestos. Each of them, praises a given city as a matrix that could welcome the theaters of prophecy of the moderns, their utopian project. One, Rome, by digesting them into its texture. The other one, by providing them islands, or nutshells where they could develop within this archipelago. And the third one, organizing purely their coexistence in the grid. Again, one, by enrolling them into a figure ground composition. The second, by genetic selection and manipulation of urban genes there. And the last one, by organizing their development in the indifference or competition in the grid. But more than that, look at their addendum, for instance. A collage city, a collection of ready-made projects ready to be engaged into the urban collage or bricolage, or a series of metaphorical projects indicating what could be a Manhattanism traveling again to Europe, leaving the island of its origin and going with OMA into Europe. Also, another very interesting thing, they all identify parks or gardens as having been the testing grounds of the strategies that they develop. 17th and 16th century French Anglo experiment for Colin Rowe here, the Havel Landschaft of Schinkel and Lene for Ungers, and finally, who would develop his own theories about that. And finally, of course, the theme park, Coney Island, as the testing ground of the technology of the fantastic that would migrate then on the mother island. And, and Rem Koolhaas would push the idea to its ultimate limits, by devising that programmatic tapestry of La Villette. And last common thing, They all enroll a specific artist as providing the keys of the strategy that they advocate. The collage of Picasso for Colin Rowe, the ambiguities of Magritte for Ungers, and of course the paranoid critical method of Dali for Rem Koolhaas. But if you look well, there is not only Dali in Delirious New York. You remember that image, but do you remember this one? You know, that day on the stage, there were not only those architects disguised in their own skyscrapers, there was also the basin woman. You know, interesting, the basin woman. Where does she come from? That's what Rem says. An apparition straight from the man's subconscious. She stands there on the stage to symbolize the entrails of architecture, or more precisely, she stands for the continuing embarrassment caused by the biological functions of the human body that have proved resistant to lofty aspirations and technological sublimation. Man's rush to the nth floor is a neck-and-neck race between plumbing and abstraction. Like an unwanted shadow, plumbing will always finish a close second. In the article that he had written in opposition, he gave another precision that was given by the booklet of the ball. Lavatory supplied by the J.L. Mott Company. Interesting. The J.L. Mott Company was the one that furnished Duchamp with his famous fountain that he signed, R. Mott, you know, almost J.L. Mott. So there is something bizarre here. Huh? You'll say maybe I'm a bit paranoid, but listen. This is what Duchamp wrote when he was to explain why the thing was refused by in the exhibition. To any innocent eye, how pleasant is its chaste simplicity of line, you know, the fountain, and color. Someone said, like a lovely Buddha. Someone said, like the legs of the ladies by Cézanne. But have they not, those ladies in their long, round nudity, always recalled to your mind the calm curves of decadent plumbers' porcelains? And he added, anyway, it's ridiculous because the only work of art that America has given are plumbery and bridges. Wow. So, you see, what do you think? There's something here in the chaste nudity and contour there. But then, you think I'm fool. But listen now. The Downtown Athletic Club, the description, you know, the men's building, you know, with the gym things here, and then the hotel where the bachelors are joined by the women who are invited, right? This is what he says, Rem. The Downtown Athletic Club is a machine for metropolitan bachelors whose ultimate peak condition have lifted them beyond the reach of fertile brides. In their frenzied self-regeneration, the men are on a collective flight upward from the specter of the basin girl. So he's exactly playing with the large glass, which was presented by Duchamp like that, with the fountain associated with the bachelors there. But he's reversing the thing. You know? The bachelors are up, right? And it is the basin woman, the bride, that tries to enter into communication with them desperately. So we have to put the large glass back on its feet. Rem, as the other, will leave soon his trace. He's leaving his trace now, thanks partly to you, Moisen, because he's building exactly in the same situation of Stirling's building over Cascadilla, his own building over Fall Creek. That will be a kind of social condenser reuniting the pieces of the School of Architecture and the legacies, the conflicting teaching legacies that are there. So, if you have 15 minutes more, I'll go into my 3 last bachelors. It will be quick. In 1969, there is at Cornell the Earth Art Show. very interesting show in the history of contemporary art, where artists are sent not only a plan of the gallery, but a map of the region, inviting them to locate their work in the site itself. So they all come, you know, all the usual suspects of land art, the guy who are going to make the history of land art are there. Robert Morris is there doing something within the museum. Hans Hacker has a piece called Grass Grows within the museum, and you have the curators trying badly to make it grow there. And then Hans Hacker stretches also a rope across Fall Creek near the School of Architecture that gathers ice there. Richard Long went to select stones in a quarry that he disposes in front of the museum there. More dangerous, Dennis Oppenheim with a chainsaw, carving the ice over Beebe Lake there, or redrawing the map of his own room within the museum outside, so the routine, of things. Okay, and then Jan Dibetz plowing the earth in 6 Mile Creek there, and doing like Magritte stuff of ambiguities with painting the trunks there. And so a map was given to people who wanted to see those things everywhere. But the guy who steals the show is Robert Smithson. Smithson doesn't come here just like that. He's very interested to come here for several reasons. He knows very well the glaciologists that I told you about. He has their book. He read them. He's very interested in those guys. And so when he comes here, he has a very good idea. He has a very precise idea of what he wants to do. He wants to do through the layers, right? So he selects a site up there, a mine, a salt mine. It goes very deep to get that rock salt mine. And then he has the museum here. So this will be the site, and this will be the non-site in his operation. And between the two, there will be a mirror trail, right? This is interesting because it is the last non-site of Robert Smithson, the very last one. So this is the mine, and this is the place in the museum where he exhibits the salt there with mirrors, the same mirrors there. And there is, he says, a double relationship here. The site has 2 levels. There is a sub-site and a site. And in the non-site, there is a non-site and a sub-non-site, except that it's reversed, the relationship between. So he has that torsion between the two things. And this is the sub-non-site in the basement of the museum. And while he's doing that, he does something off-record, not for the exhibition, which is the first non-site done by Smithson on-site, right? And this is finished now for non-sites. He will not intervene. That's what he was doing before. He was exhibiting non-site, making people travel to sites mentally. Before and after, he will intervene directly on-site. So now it will be a 3-dimensional picture of a site, but built on the site itself, right, as a kind of 3D portrait of it. Okay. And he also, at the time when he was there, was just published by Vladimir Nabokov, a book called Ada, a fantastic book in which, in the middle, you know that Smithson was a fan of Nabokov. He had all his books. He was completely into Nabokov. He quotes him with quotes or without quotes all the time. So he came here, he knew where he was coming. And in that book that is issued that very year, you have that piece of dialogue in the middle. What on earth is an artist? And the guy answers, an underground observatory. If one guy had the trajectory of an underground observatory, this is Gordon Matta-Clark. Gordon Matta-Clark is the students of those guys, of the Rowe guys, of the Korb Academy and the Space Talk for 5 years in the 60s, and is present at the Earth Art Show. He stayed there. And actually, when I was there 7 years ago, I found many photos where he's there. Some were published, some not at the time. You see him working with Oppenheim. You see him plowing the earth for Dibetz. We know that he was with Smithson also Probably he gave ropes to, because he was into ropes, to Hans Hacker to do his thing. So the Earth Art Show is Gordon Matta-Clark. And he did his own piece here, in the exact same place where a few months before, the student of Ungers had, that drawing that I showed you. So this is probably a comment on that project, right? You can cross a gorge with other means than that, the hyper buildings, and it's as efficient, right? You might know that Gordon Matta-Clark had a godfather named Marcel Duchamp. When he's at Cornell in 1968, Duchamp dies. And we know that he was into, there was tales that Gordon Matta-Clark gathered his friend in a room and had somebody read the papers of the green box, And that while she was reading, he inflated with a reversed vacuum cleaner motor, inflated a plastic thing. So that after a while, people had to leave because it took and when everybody had left, because the plastic had taken the shape of the room, the homage was paid. Which is kind of nice when you think that Duchamp defined himself as a respirateur, which sounds in French as vacuum cleaner, and etc. Anyway, so we know, the career of Matta-Clark afterwards. After Cornell, he thought he would work with Noguchi for a while, did these kinds of drawing. Noguchi was almost his stepfather. So dreamt of becoming maybe going into landscape architecture, and then went to New York, did this project, which I think influenced Smithson to do this one and not the other way around, and started his investigation into buildings. I will not say anything about that, except that it's interesting to see that work in the perspective with the transparency of Colin Rowe. Achieving phenomenal transparency into building with very literal means, chainsaw, right? But obtaining incredible four-dimensional picture, mazes, right, across a building considered as space-time through which you cut. And you know the story of the An-Architecture group. When he goes, he's invited to participate into an exhibition at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, where maybe Koolhaas is writing his book in there at the time. No, he left just a few months before. I can't use that. But he might have been there, right? He might have been there. And he's invited by Peter Eisenman, and he says, I want to shot the windows, and put images. And they say, okay, it was in January maybe, or they say maybe one or two. And then he come at night with a air pump gun and shots them all, right? And comes the day after with those photos of buildings of the Bronx or Queens whose windows were already shattered completely. And he wanted to put, and I heard that some of the photos were maybe by a building by Richard Meyer already broken at the time. I wanted to put those images in the frames with the window. So you see the comment there. Anyway, Matta-Clark is probably the guy who went the deeper and the higher into all these layers of that vertical landscape towards an art of memory, when he did that heartbreaking project for his brother who had committed suicide in Paris, digging the ground of the gallery, and it's called Descending Steps for Batan, for his brother there. And then almost at the same time doing that project, Jacob's Ladder, the art of hope, really, in the Documenta in Kassel. And so I come to my last guy. My last guy is, of course, Vladimir Nabokov, who spent 12 years in Ithaca, coming from Europe. He came to the States in 1940, as you know, and in 48 was invited to teach, was first here, working in the I guess his Museum of Zoology here. He was a famous lepidopterist, specialized into the sexual organs of butterflies, and worked there. and came on the invitation of this guy to Ithaca to teach as professor of Russian and professor of literature there. So what did he do there? It's very interesting. This is the moment when he's becoming an American writer. He was a fantastic Russian writer, and he's shifting. It's very rare in the history. And he's writing his own memories, right? And this is what he says in Speak Memory, the book that he's writing in English when he lands in Ithaca. Beneath the sky of my America, to sigh for one locality in Russia. He's superimposing the two landscapes. So he's going, revisiting all these landscape of these estates in St. Petersburg, etc. And this is what he says at some point. Perfect definition of palimpsestuous writing. I confess I do not believe in time. I like to fold my magic carpet after use in such a way as to superimpose one part of the pattern to another. Let visitors trip. And this is exactly what he's doing. I'll show you how. I have to read this. The kind of poetry, he's evoking the way how he wrote his first poems in the estates of Russia. The kind of poetry I produced in those days was hardly anything more than a sign I made of being alive, of passing or having passed or hoping to pass through certain intense emotions. It was a phenomenon of orientation rather than of art, thus comparable to stripes of paint on a roadside rock or to a pillared heap of stones marking a mountain trails. But then, in a sense, all poetry is positional. To try to express one's position in regard to the universe embraced by consciousness is an immemorial urge. The arms of consciousness reach out and grope, and the longer they are, the better. Tentacles, not wings, are Apollo's natural members. Vivian Bloodmark, which is obviously an anagram of Vladimir Nabokov, Vivian Bloodmark, a philosophical friend of mine in later years, used to say that while the scientist sees everything that happens in one point of space, the poet feels everything that happens in one point of time. Lost in thought, he taps his knee with his wand-like pencil, and at the same instant, a car, New York license plate, passes along the road. A child bangs the screen door of a neighboring porch. An old man yawns in a misty Turkestan orchard. A granule of cinder-gray sand is rolled by the wind on Venus. A Dr. Jacques Hirsch in Grenoble puts on his reading glasses. And trillions of other such trifles occur, all forming an instantaneous and transparent organism of events of which the poet, sitting in a lounge chair at Ithaca, New York, is the nucleus. So you see, that justifies completely my paranoia. So Nabokov, what does he do? Well, he teaches. He teaches, and what does he teach? How does he teach literature? By drawing the spaces described by the writers, right? Mansfield Park, for instance. Where is it? How is it, right? How is the estate there? The cap of Bovary in Madame Bovary, what does it look like, right? He had students to note all the details, the colors, everything you had to do. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's very fine, but where is he Jekyll and where Hyde? So you have to draw a plan, etc. Many students in architecture said the school was crap at the time, but the courses of Nabokov were worth all the tuition, right, for architecture. So he would do that. For instance, there was a student told that once, Nabokov read all his lectures. And so one day, people felt like a bit, it was a bit boring. So he felt that. At some point, he stopped reading, right? And he said, he closed all the windows and the shutters in the room, turned the light off, and then he came back and he said, in the firmament of Russian literature, this is Gogol. And one light. In the firmament of Russian literature, this is Pushkin, another light. And then he released like all the shutters, vroom, like that. In the firmament of Russian literature, this is Tolstoy, of course. This is the wagon of Anna Karenine. You have to know exactly how it is. The Cattleyas of Odette in Proust, etc. This is what he says about Proust. Very interesting, about synestheses in Proust. A garden in a concert hall and a picture gallery in the garden. This is one of my definitions of Proust art. You could give that an exercise, no, in design. a garden you consider. The metamorphosis, a beetle, you know, what is a beetle exactly? And the room, the Samsa flat, how is it, you know, exactly like that? And Joyce, classes on Ulysses. He looks at houses in Ithaca here to explain what is the house of Molly Bloom. Go and look this one, it's exactly the same, etc., etc. Then he chases butterflies with his wife in Ithaca everywhere. And during his summer trips where Vera drives, because he has no driver's license, while he rides, right? And then Vera, so, you know, anyway, that's too long. Vera types the books, and so Pnin, who is a completely Cornellian thing, is published there. Lolita, while he writes while he's there. And the most important of all those books that I urge you to read, which is Pale Fire. Pale Fire is exactly a hypertextual novel, a hypertextual landscape. What is it? It's one guy who is a poet, 65 years old, very famous, John Shade, writing a poem. And so you have the poem, 999 verses of that poem, very domestic life, telling about his life, his wife, his daughter who committed suicide, etc., a whole thing. And then the commentary of that to that poem, by his neighbor, right, who is spying on him, and who is expecting that the poem that he will read and comment in the end is all about himself, because he's feeding that poet that he admires with the events of his own life, supposedly the life of a kind of king of a kingdom in Russia or somewhere like that, you know, in great north. And he will be very disappointed to find out that the poem is not about him. And so in the commentary, so that's the first reading, 2 words, right? The irony of complete separation. But then when you read it carefully, some butterflies go from the poem into the commentary. Some weird things happen. You start thinking, is John Shade the guy who wrote the comment? It's a whole mixed thing that happened, a hyper landscape anyway. I'm very surprised that Nabokov didn't use, and this will be my conclusion, didn't use a very interesting event that happened during the First World War in Ithaca. Ithaca was retroactively, you have to know, named the Hollywood of the East, because several movie production company landed there, and they had a deal with the city. They wanted to be on the shore of the lake, where there was a public park called Stewart Park there, which is still there, right? And so they had a deal with the city. The city said, you can come here, but it will stay a park. So better than Trumi in La Villette, right? A real movie production park, public park, right? And so they had that deal. And they did fantastic movies, you know, there, of cliff hangers. It was fantastic. You could do everything, you know. You could throw streetcars in the gorges for the diamonds of the Raja. You know, you could have all those fantastic scenes. You had Siberia every winter. You had jungles for Tarzan. You know, it was a kind of travel agency, you know, name it, you know, all the landscape. So it was a hyper landscape, really, there. And all the stars, you know, the movie stars, Pearl White, came there and enjoyed their stay at the Clinton House. The students enrolled in the movies playing parts, you know. It was complete reality and fiction completely mixed there. So you see, this is my Coney Island part at the end of the book. So, you know, movies, the thing that we did for the movie became attraction for the park, you know. It was a kind of... and there is a fantastic story. Of course, in 1918, they left, 1919 or 20, they left. They left because a movie was almost going to talk, you know. It was not the cliffhangers. It was about, you know, psychology. It was, you know, faces now. It was becoming something else. So, you know, enough with the bad weather of the winter of Ithaca. Let's move to Hollywood, and, well, anyway, it will be in studio. So what happened is that the firemen took all the films, you know, because they were nitrate, very dangerous. They could inflame. And they took all the films and dumped them in Cayuga Lake. So you see the thing, you see that all those monads, all those images are like a lake bottom sludge, but they are like, it's become a 4-dimensional reservoir of floating images of Siberia, jungles, everything. Nabokov, I think, should have used that. In 1959, he leaves Ithaca. Why? He didn't plan to. He went to Europe because Lolita was such a triumph, and he landed in Montreux, which is Montreux exactly in the same geographical situation as Ithaca, inlet of Lake Geneva. Lake Geneva, the original of Ithaca, you could say, paraphrasing the last novel, The Original of Laura, the original of Ithaca. And this is what he said in one of his last classes. Literature is a pure fantasy, just like Anna Karenine is pure fantasy. Just as Kafka's The Metamorphosis is a fantasy, just as Cornell University will be a fantasy if I ever happen to write about it someday in retrospect. And he knows what he's saying because he's writing Pale Fire at that moment. I want to thank you very much for your attention and for your patience. Thank you.
Everyone's still here. Do you want to take a question?
Sure.
We only have about an hour and a half for questions, so I don't know if anybody has anything.
Oh, I recognize people. I recognize people. Friends of Cornell.
I have a question.
Are you exhausted? Yeah.
What would it take to have you, when you finish this book, come here and devote this kind of attention to our neck of the woods?
You mean Harvard? But you have so many singers at Harvard, so many poets from here. It has been sung so many times. So I'd love to, but I will need time. I would need a long time at Harvard.